why we knew about her fabulous work. Taught the Fraker. She was in the Robert Johnson Health and Society Scholars Program. But now she's escaped to Yale, where she's an assistant professor in the epidemiology and what do they call the social behavioral sciences part of the School of Public Health. She has a PhD in health behavior and health education from the University of Michigan. And before coming to her postdoc here, was also a postdoc at the University of Michigan's Population Study Center. Danya Keene works at the intersection of public health and housing policy, and she has an impressively large body of work on the consequences of public housing demolition and displacement in population health. She's done a number of qualitative and multi-method investigations of 6 and moving to opportunity programs. And she has a current project, which in full disclosure, I should say that we've been talking about for a few years now, the relationship between health status and mortgage foreclosure among low-income and minority populations. So we're going to get that paper out next week, right? Over lunch. So Dr. Keene has a keen interest in how social policy writ large impacts neighborhoods by creating places that are marked by stigma or by social capital, and sometimes both stigma and social capital at the same time. In this paper, Dr. Keene examines how the demolition of public housing projects in Atlanta and the subsequent displacement of residents into private market housing affected residents' sense of political efficacy and social citizenship. And John is going to present very briefly, just for about 10 minutes. Let's make sure there's a few slides to keep you all awake and engaged, but it shouldn't be hard. After which, Mark Stern is going to serve as discussant. Mark is a member of the committee that designed this year's speaker series for you. He is also Kenneth L. M. Gray Professor of Social Welfare and History at Penn and the co-director of the Urban Studies Program at Penn. Professor Stern's expertise is on the social impact of the arts in American cities, which at first glance might make him seem a very odd choice of discussion for this paper. He was not chosen because he was the last man standing. I know that Danya gets to talk all the time to housing experts and public health experts. It might be helpful, actually, to approach this paper from a different angle. But there are some similarities here in the kind of work that these two do. Like Professor Keene, Mark Stern has interest in the role of place in the production of social inequality, and in the less tangible influences on community well-being and community capacity in low-income urban neighborhoods. So while there are a lot of people who sort of focus on inequality and poverty and the way that they're produced at the neighborhood level, I think what's really interesting about what both of you do is that you're focused sort of on the less material aspects of that. Mark Stern also co-authored the important article, The New African-American Inequality, that appeared in the Journal of American History in 2005. And I think this article in particular provides some very useful ideas about how one might go about deepening and historicizing some of the insights that Danya offers in her paper today. So maybe you'll choose to comment from a totally different perspective, but those were some of the thoughts that I had in mind when I chose you as discussant. So thank you for agreeing to do that. Danya, why don't you go ahead and show us what you've got?
Okay, thank you, Julie, for that introduction. Thank you to you and the committee for inviting me to come here. It's actually really exciting to have these opportunities to present something that I've talked about a lot from a different angle, being part of this sort of interdisciplinary and non-public health forum. So, and as Julie said, I'm really just going to do a 10-minute overview of the paper, since we want to leave lots of time for Mark's comments and for us all to have a conversation about it. I hope you've had a chance to read it. If you haven't, I'm sure we'll still have so, jumping right back.
It's really short.
There we go. write a paper about housing as a social right. And I just had to focus on one example of recent housing policy that has potentially posed a big threat to the right to housing among socioeconomically marginalized U.S. citizens. This example, the title is this massive demolition of public housing that's occurred in most cities around the country, although not all cities. Some of you might know across the country there's been this like massive demolition of public housing, of these federally owned public housing developments, as part of this broad shift towards a tenant-based model of housing assistance, where individuals get housing vouchers that then they can use to subsidize the private market rental unit. And several scholars have suggested that this shift in housing policy has really undermined access to affordable housing by making it less of a guaranteed social right and more of a contingently available market good. And there's a large literature that's looked at some of the consequences of public housing demolition for a range of individual outcomes, such as housing quality, neighborhood quality, education, income, and health. And some of my own work has been concerned with this, how demolition affects health. And for today's paper, since I had this opportunity to move a little bit outside of the public health world, I decided to focus on how public housing has affected, to move beyond the individual, to think about how public housing demolition has affected these collective processes of civic engagement and political participation. So in trying to stick with the theme of the seminar here, essentially asking you the question, how have changes in assisted housing policy affected the ability of marginalized groups to exercise their full citizenship? So this is really a new area for me. So, I'm coming from the public health world, and so I hope that you all, as political science folks, can help me out think about these issues.
Danya, just to be clear, there are lots of people who aren't scientists in this room.
Okay.
And they're proud of it.
Okay. Awesome. So anyways, as you may know, probably know from the paper, it's set in Atlanta, Georgia, and Atlanta's really a particularly interesting and important place to look at public housing demolition. It's really been at the forefront of the shift to a tenant-based model of housing assistance. Atlanta was one of the first cities to take advantage of HUD's Hope 6 program to demolish and redevelop public housing in the late 1990s. A lot of this was happening around the time of the Olympics. The Summer Olympics were in Atlanta in '96, and the city wanted to sort of redevelop its downtown, and so one part of that was getting rid of these public housing developments. Then in 2007, the city decided to get rid of all of the public housing that was left, and that demolition happened in 2009. And so it's really been the first city to essentially get rid of family-based low-income housing. There's still some public housing that's available to senior citizens or disabled, low-income disabled individuals, but the family public housing developments are not. And so it's an entirely voucher-based model. So the study design was 40 in-depth interviews that were conducted with residents who had moved from these demolished public housing developments. And the interviews were conducted about 6 to 12 months after people had moved. And I did most of the interviews myself. I think I did 30 of the 40 interviews myself. The other 10 were done by 2 Georgia State University graduate students who were helping out with the project. And the sample comes from this larger longitudinal study of public housing relocation and health that is still ongoing. I think they're in their 3rd wave of data collection. Some faculty at Georgia State University are running that project. So in whatever the 4 or 5 minutes that I have left, I'm just going to quickly outline some of the major themes that emerge from these interviews that sort of contrast the experience before demolition and experience after relocation. A major theme throughout the interviews was this sense of rootedness and collective responsibility and racial equity. So what was a sense of rootedness that people felt in their public housing developments? So many participants had been in these developments for many years, and even those who hadn't been there for many years, even the younger folks, they had grown up around people who had been there for many years. And so they described this sort of sense of being like one big family where everybody knew each other because everybody had been there for so long. And they also talked about looking out for each other, organizing activities in their community, sort of being involved in sort of, everybody looked out for one another and helped one another. So the sort of sense of collective responsibility. They also talked a lot in their interviews about the more formal participation in these, more formal civic engagement through the actions of these tenant councils. So all public housing developments have tenant councils. Some of them are more active, some of them are less active. But for many of my participants, these tenant councils were really, and it really seemed to be a salient opportunity to be engaged in their community. So they talk about sort of using the tenants councils as a way to advocate on behalf of their community. So one example, one participant talked about how the city had taken bus service away from their neighborhood, and so they had come together and went to City Hall to get the bus back. They also talked about the tenants councils as mediating between the residents and the management of public housing developments. So one participant who was the president of the grievance committee, which is sort of a subcommittee of this council, talked about negotiating with management if a family was going to be kicked out for a lease violation and helping to sort of advocate on behalf of those families to as she says, we help save a lot of people from getting put out. And also the tenants councils seem to be an important source of mediation between the residents and the Atlanta Housing Authority. And this became really apparent in the context of demolition, where residents were often not happy with demolition itself or the way that it was being carried out. And the tenants councils could sort of speak up on behalf of the residents in this process. So one participant says, some said that everything was going to be easy. She's referring to demolition. But then you find out they were lying. So we got a lawyer. We had one lady who was the president out there, the president of the tenants councils, and she got a lawyer for the whole complex. And they really, the residents didn't actually have a lot of power to affect the course of demolition, but in some cases they were able to make sort of small changes in the way the process was carried out. So looking to what things were like in the private market, so the civic engagement that participants described in public housing was very much absent from the descriptions of their post-relocation private market communities. In particular, these new private market rental communities didn't have these formal organizing structures of the tenants councils that they talked about in public housing. So one participant spent much of the interview sort of lamenting this loss, and she says at one point, "We need to have a meeting. We need to. I can't do that no more because there's no more Oakwood homes." And other participants said that, well, there were neighborhood organizations that they could potentially participate in, but they were reluctant to get involved because they felt stigmatized as former public housing residents. So one woman says, they find out I'm from Oakwood, they're probably looking down on me. And she's referring to her decision not to get involved in the neighborhood organization. So in addition to these lack of formal organizing opportunities, participants also described communities that weren't necessarily conducive to the kind of community building that occurred in public housing. So they talk about a more private ethos where people don't spend a lot of time outside, where people keep to themselves, where people are just driving to work and home again. So one participant says, you don't see nobody knocking on each other's door over here. And I think one reason for this, there's several reasons probably for this more private ethos. I think one reason is this lack of residential stability in these new neighborhoods. People talk about a constant flux of their neighbors, that people are always moving in and out. These are low income neighborhoods. There's a lot of eviction happening. And the public housing residents themselves also describe these processes of eviction and issues of affordability that are inhibiting their own residential stability. So one participant says, like certain people getting put out of their homes and apartments because they can't afford their rent. I mean, it's crazy. A lot of homeless people, it's going to be a lot. And so, they have these rent vouchers. Public housing, all their utilities were paid for. And so you hear a lot of stories about in the private market, people getting evicted because they can't pay their electric bills. Also, they can be evicted because the landlord wants to evict them. They can also be evicted because the landlord decides to sell the unit, so that there's not the same structures of stability that existed in public housing. And actually, if you look at HUD data, it's very clear that voucher-based rent-assisted residents have, on average, less tenancy, shorter tenancy than public housing. So I think that's probably contributed to this. So in conclusion, so it appears that one consequence of public housing demolition has been to reduce the capacity of residents to come together and advocate for their collective rights. For these participants, this new model of housing assistance in the form of vouchers doesn't seem to be as conducive to civic engagement and collective organizing as was traditional public housing. Voucher-based tenants seem to experience more housing instability and stigmatization that may prevent the development of this rootedness and collective responsibility. And they also don't have access to these formal organizing structures that exist in public housing. And I think another point, which I think actually isn't in the paper, but I think perhaps needs to be, as thinking about these processes in a historical context, public housing demolition is really sort of the latest example of displacement for the same communities, many of which were displaced by urban renewal initiatives in the 1950s and 60s, or have been displaced by more recent gentrification. So I think this really raises questions about the cumulative loss of this civic participation and citizenship over generations, or even within a generation, and what that means for participation and citizenship. And now,
I've discovered that if I try to speak for 10 minutes or less, if I don't write it out, I always exceed myself. So you'll excuse me, I'm actually going to read it to stick it in content. Danya Keene's paper makes a compelling case that the costs associated with the displacement of public housing residents aren't just a matter of the quality of housing, but of the perception of community integration and isolation. Her findings build on those of the moving to opportunity experiments that showed that participants often left better neighborhoods, so-called better neighborhoods, to which they had been directed to move back to worse neighborhoods, where they could connect to their existing social networks. Although the paper, taken on its own terms, makes a strong case, it does a less satisfying job of engaging the ostensible theme of today's session, the housing as a social right. It notes that the UN Declaration and a number of federal housing laws articulated a right to decent housing, but like the language of full employment included in the 1946 Employment Act or the 1978 Humphrey-Hawkins Act, it at best is honored in the breach. So what I'd like to do is make a few points about the paper itself, and then make a few suggestions about how we might think about housing as a social right. As I've said, the interviews Keene analyzes makes a clear and convincing case that her informants saw community life in their former public housing developments as desirable, and experienced their new private housing alternatives as promoting exclusion and isolation. The paper makes an important point here. The stigmatization of public housing always ran up against the fact that most public housing authorities had long waiting lists, reminding us of that old joke about two diners complaining that the food at a restaurant was terrible and the portions were too small. More to the point, the stereotyping of public housing tended to cover up the counterexamples of functional housing authorities, whether they were large ones like New York's that Nicholas Bloom writes about in Public Housing That Worked, or those in smaller communities. Certainly, the idea that we can solve the problem of housing needs of the poor by destroying their current dwellings has a long history that stretches at least from the early industrial cities to contemporary Mumbai. Still, I was unconvinced by Keene's somewhat uncritical reporting of her informants' memories of their former residencies as like a family. We need to make a distinction here between these statements as expression of the informant's perception of their loss and as reports on the actual nature of social life in the projects. I'm convinced about the former. Clearly they have felt the loss, but less convinced about it as an accurate representation of social conditions. First, beyond the stigmatization, there is plenty of evidence that life in many projects was rather Hobbesian. I threw that in for the political theorists. Second, we know that nostalgia isn't what it used to be. In my own work, I've had to reconcile residents' fond memories of life in African American neighborhoods after World War II with the historic record. Of course, the memories are valid as memories, but I found the evidence of widespread chronic joblessness and astronomical poverty rates more reliable sources of information on actual social conditions. Any of us, if forced out of our homes, would hold positive memories of them. I suspect that displacement has made the former lives of her informants look better in retrospect. In fact, Keene made herself be guilty of a bit of nostalgia. She contrasts the right to housing articulated in the 49 Housing Act with its contemporary reduction of housing to a market good. Yet the preamble of the 49 Act notes that private enterprise shall, this is a quote, private enterprise shall be encouraged to serve as large a part of the total need as it can, and that, quote, government assistance shall be utilized where feasible to enable private enterprise to serve more of the total need. Keene could strengthen her argument by one of two means. Either she could clarify that she is referring essentially to her informant's psychological loss, not the actual conditions they experience. Alternatively, if she intends to argue that life in public housing really was much better than their current circumstances, her case would be strengthened by triangulation, by bringing in other sources of evidence so that the memories of her informants weren't the only source of support for her claim. As I was reading Keene's paper, I was reminded of an earlier DCC speaker, Irene Blumrod, in Blumrod's study of immigrant political integration in Toronto and Boston. Blumrod proposed the concept of structured mobilization, by which she meant that government can play a critical role in fostering civic engagement by seeding and funding efforts by the nonprofit sector and providing services directly to the target population. As a policy proposal, I read Keene's paper to suggest that public housing residents experience this sort of structured mobilization in the form of tenant councils and public activities, and that similar programs might be desirable as a complement to the vouchers that many of her informants received. Let me turn now to make just 3 points about housing as a social right. First, the right to shelter. In 1979, the New York State Supreme Court in Callahan versus Carey ordered the city and state of New York to provide shelter for homeless men in the city. It based its decision on the state constitution's requirement that there is an obligation to care for the needy. Since then, there has been an ongoing battle over the limits of the Callahan decision. Of course, if we employ Titmus's distinction between a residual and institutional social welfare ideology, we can see that this right really derives from the old poor law tradition. Like any residual approach, the right to shelter promotes a dualism between the few unfortunates who qualify for low-quality benefits and a larger number who qualify for nothing at all. Ironically, many housing advocates, including my colleague Dennis Culhane, now see the right to shelter as a barrier to moving resources from shelter provision to developing permanent housing solutions for the homeless. In addition to the fiscal limits on such a program, government officials fear that providing a special stream of affordable housing for the homeless might encourage millions of ill-housed Americans to enter that queue. Second point. In a recent chapter I wrote on housing, I compared the American experience with housing and with food. Why have we so failed to address the question of affordable housing at the same time that there is a broad consensus, with the exception of a couple of hundred Republicans in the House of Representatives, that the government has a responsibility to prevent hunger in America? I'd suggest 2 reasons. First, following Polanyi, I'd suggest that housing, like money and labor, are false commodities that really aren't produced for the market. In particular, as a positional good, providing housing for one person inevitably influences the value for others. This explains why the 49 Act did not require all communities to provide public housing, because of the widespread fear that allowing low-income families to enter middle and upper-income communities would cause their existing residents to experience diminished quality of life and property values. Second, as my American political development friends would remind us, the political economy and institutional framing of the two issues are profoundly different. The food stamps program has historically served as a linchpin between the interests of farm state legislators and generous crop subsidies and of urban legislators and welfare of their constituents. Affordable housing, meanwhile, has rarely overcome the opposition of mortgage bankers, real estate agents, and developers, organized both at the national and local level. Indeed, to overcome this opposition, the federal government created the low-income housing tax credit, which has created many units of housing for low and moderate income Americans, but few units for the poorest individuals and families that are the subject of Keene's paper. My final point. As I read Keene's paper, it struck me that we might frame her argument within Henri Lefebvre's famous idea of the right to the city. For Lefebvre, the urban dimension of the class struggle was a battle between the exchange value of the bourgeoisie and the claim of the use value of the city of the working class. As he writes, the right to the city cannot be conceived just as a simple visiting right. It can only be formulated as a transformed and renewed right to urban life. If we use this lens to view Keene's story, we find her informants making a claim that their social life, their right to decent housing and social connection should not be infringed by the interests of developers, labor unions, and housing authorities to make a quick buck from the creative destruction of Hope 6 and associated programs. I doubt if Lefebvre had Keene's grandmothers in mind when he conceptualized the right to the city, but the idea might provide a useful starting point for understanding their demands for decent housing and a full social life. Thanks.
Danya, do you want to take a crack back at him, or another question?
I mean, I can say this, I'll say some things. I've heard, I love the idea of thinking about Lefebvre's right to the city, and I think that, and also the point you made about the political economy of food versus housing, and I think, that's really, I've never thought about it I've never thought about food in that way, but I think when we think about the private model of housing assistance, it sort of it's putting incentives. The incentives, the food, the incentives are for the people who produce it, it's putting incentives into the hands of developers, but those incentives are really working on the behalf of the most marginalized residents. Basically, there's developments that are usually partnerships with private developers. There's a financial incentive to have the highest paying of the poor in those units, and so I think your point of thinking about food and that is really helpful to think about how those incentives work. I also want to clarify that I hope in the paper that I wasn't making contrast between the 1949 Public Housing Act and the current situation. I actually see the 1949 Public Housing Act as part of this same continuous process. It declared housing as a right, but in the same breath it demolished the neighborhoods of the relatives or the ancestors or the same individuals who are in the neighbor. So I want to clarify that that was the right to housing in name, but not in practice. And then I guess I think this issue of nostalgia is really important, and not just the issue of nostalgia, but the issue of romanticization. I don't want to, and I'm trying to be careful when I write about these issues, and I think I was less careful in this paper to not romanticize these public housing developments, and not to say, oh, these places were so perfect, we should just keep them as they were, because that's not, that's certainly not my argument. And they were providing a resource that may no longer be available now that they're gone, particularly for the hardest to house public housing residents. But I don't. But they were incredibly underfunded. Funding. No new public housing has been constructed, I think, since the 1980s. So these were dilapidated, underfunded developments. And I think that the conditions in these developments isn't necessarily a function of their form, but sort of the way that it was carried out. We could have public housing that is federally owned and operated and not dilapidated and not and segregated and crime-ridden neighborhoods. So I think it's important to distinguish between the form and the way it's carried out in practice. And there are examples in the U.S. of public housing. New York City public housing functions very well. It also has an impact. And then, okay, so now to the final this issue of nostalgia. I think it's really important. I definitely think that there's some nostalgia going on. People have lost their homes and they're remembering they're experiencing it as a loss, and they're remembering their homes with sort of rose-colored glasses. I think there's also two levels of nostalgia going on. I think there's the older generation who's remembering what these places were like in their youth. Although, I was very careful to also find examples from younger folks who didn't experience these developments in the 1960s. So how to address that? I think one way is triangulation. I do have this survey data that I can draw on sort of more objectively. And I think the other way is to say this is an experience of psychological loss. This is people's subjective experience. That's meaningful in and of itself, that this is their experience, whether it's a reflection of reality or not. And I think the third thing is to think about the processes and the structures. So they're saying that they're saying that it was like this here and it's not like this here. So why might that be? So housing instability is one mechanism. I think that's not just a part of people's memories, but that's actually borne out. If we look at HUD data, if we look at survey data, that we see that people can stay in these places for a long time and then they move to the private market and they're moving around all the time. And I think that's a potentially legitimate mechanism through which this civic engagement is happening. So I think those are three ways, but I think it's something that I definitely need to be cautious about and be more cautious about in presenting the data. That these are people's memories, they're subjective experiences. They're not, we don't have before and after. So I think that's important. I appreciate that.
Danya Mark sit in front of the room so that she's not speaking to something behind her.
Well, we can do some quick reconfiguration. Here, why don't we pull this table up? We're going to set a table.
Yeah.
Just sit.
No, I'm here.
All right. Questions? Let's start with you, and we'll go back.
So thank you. This was really interesting. The paper was interesting, and also I thought the comments were very helpful. And your comment about nostalgia made me think about one concern that I had, or one sort of lingering question that I had after reading or while reading the paper, and that has to do with the way that you define or describe civic engagement. And my sense was that the psychological status that you guys were just talking about, the nostalgia and the sense of loss and the strong memories of kinship that were actually or supposedly part of life in the public housing. This sense of loss does change the behavior of individuals because they feel less rooted and less connected in their current communities. And so if we define their activities as a result of this sense of kinship and rootedness as civic engagement, right? The things that they did for each other, knocking on each other's door and calling the neighbor grandma and fighting for the bus route, and all of these different activities are the result of the psychological feeling of kinship and membership and rootedness because of the long-term stability and connection. I'm just assuming for the sake of argument that that's at least partially how it actually was. So if they lose that, then they are disconnected and disaffected and not engaged. But my question that I have still in my mind after this description is that I'm not sure that a lot of this is civic engagement, right? I mean, I feel that a lot of this is community engagement, relationship, and sense of kinship, but it doesn't amount to a civic opportunities that they would have to engage politically or civically with their environment and institutions. Maybe the councils to some extent, also in a minimal or limited way, but probably not a lot of the other things. And so I was just wondering if you would think that all of these could be lumped together as civic engagement, or if you would think maybe they could dissect it in a productive way.
Well, do you mind holding off on your answer so we can collect a few questions? There was one in the back. Yeah.
Sure, so I just had two quick questions, and I'm very unfamiliar with this literature, so it could just be very easy answers. But it seemed like there were two things that were raised. The first is, it seemed like there was an implying tension between, at least my very limited understanding is that in many of these housing projects, they're relatively racially homogenous, very similar racial groups. And so when they move away from public provided housing, are they moving to areas less racially homogenous? And so is there some connection here between racial homogeneity and solidarity that you're getting at? And if that's not the case, then I was just wondering, how important is this temporal issue then? You said that the people you interviewed had lived in their new homes for a year or less, whereas the people before reported how much they had known everybody for a very long time, they'd seen all these same people for a long time. And so if we would expect these same kind of results to persist even after they've perhaps lived in these new private homes for longer periods of time.
One more?
So my question is around the concept of housing as a social right. And I think what I've heard from both of you, it seems like it's either a social right or it isn't. And I guess I'd like to hear you talk about whether or not it can be on a continuum. And what I mean by that is I've lived in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New Haven while a lot of those big complexes were cut down and built up. And I didn't hear a lot of controversy about whether or not the people I was running around with, whether or not people should actually have housing. What was in all three of those cities was a tremendous flashpoint was whether or not that housing should have air conditioning. And because that came out in editorials in newspapers in all those cities as a tension between lower middle class and lower class people getting this housing. And so I guess I'm thinking about whether, is there a certain kind of housing that all people are entitled to, but that that it sort of, what do we give people?
Let's take this first batch.
Okay. So I think the comment about what is civic, I think that's an important comment. The way I think I was trying to frame it was that these ties and this rootedness and doing stuff for the community, that is one thing that gives rise to the sort of more civic, which maybe I'm not even defining, but which is like people actually being able to go to City Hall and say we want our bus back, or actually being able to say and go to City Hall and say no, you're not going to throw out these families, you're not going to carry out the demolition in this way, you're not. So in not having so the change in the new communities of not even having that mechanism or having that collective body, which I think partly comes out of the social ties. So I think that's the way that, and how much of it is civic, and how much, political participation I really don't have data on. I didn't see, people didn't talk about their political participation in the interview, so I can't speak to that, which is a shame. But I think, sort of on the civic level, sort of advocating for your community, at City Hall with, or with sort of the management. I saw that as coming out of these more psychological processes. So, it's a question about racial. So in this particular example of Atlanta, they're not going to neighborhoods that are racially heterogeneous. They're going to predominantly, and in the survey data, there's survey data, the HUD data will show this too. They're going to predominantly black neighborhoods. They're going from predominantly black neighborhoods to predominantly black neighborhoods. So I don't think that it's a racial solidarity is at play here. It's not to say that that's not the case in other places, but in this particular example, no. And the temporal issue is really important as well, because and I too wonder, well, what's going to happen 10 years from now, And so that's why I think the issue of instability really speaks to me. They're not going to be there probably 10 years from now. They've already moved. Some of them have already moved twice by the time I interview them. So So I think, my hypothesis is that no, that this won't be created, but that's, that's an empirical question. We should go back and look in 10 years. I think it's an important question. I personally just don't think that it won't, because of the instability issues. Then the other, the question about the continuum of what's housing, and that reminded me of the right to shelter, which reminded me of this New Yorker article recently that Ian Fraser wrote about the right to shelter case in New York, and he had these really these examples of people spending their whole day in these basically warehouses sort of places trying to get to their shelter. So so what is that? What does it mean to be housed? And that's what one of the things I was trying. If you have to spend all day in line, so you can go have a bed that you can sleep in for 6 hours, and then go get in line again. And so one of the things I wanted to say with this paper is housing is more than just having that roof over your head. And it's also more than having an air conditioner too. It's a nice kitchen. Some of these people actually moved into great, beautiful new apartments that had new air conditioning and new and so and that's important. But I think there's something else that's important about having a home that's also maybe not more important, but also important in thinking about the right to housing. So
I guess all I'd say is, there's been, I guess, this residualization of what used to be seen as more universal rights. We're seeing it now with, means testing Medicare as out there. So, it just strikes me with housing, we never really got very far in terms of universalization. If anything, kind of drifting down.
Well, to pursue issues that have already come up, I took the lesson of your paper on reflection to be not so much that isn't it a shame that we lost these public housing facilities, which, as you said, there were some good things but bad things as well. The real point of your paper about engagement and memory and so forth is that people did have a sense of rootedness and connection that was built up by being in the same place with the same people over a period of time. And that suggests that we should think about housing as a social right, not so much in terms of the particular kinds of housing structure per se, but as a concern to make sure that people have good housing where they are, or at least where they want to be. You don't want to limit mobility, but so that the focus, should not be on public housing per se, or more dispersed housing, but on programs that assist people in improving housing without having to be disrupted yet again, moved yet again. And in that case, again, the message isn't so much public housing per se, but housing to assist people in maintaining the kinds of connections and a sense of place that are conducive to at least some forms of community engagement. So the question is that the right lesson to take?
I think so. And I become more interested in residential stability more broadly from doing this work. I think as a model, federally owned and operated housing is more conducive to stability than the private market model, which is low income housing. The private market is very, very unstable, especially in the context of gentrification. And so I think the lesson is really, I think the core message for me, is about stability. And I actually have another paper that looks at people who voluntarily, voluntarily because they were, they moved voluntarily because there were no jobs where they were, the neighborhoods were too dangerous, there were not good schools, and some of the same trade-offs happened even though they were voluntary moves. So.
Right. And just the same lesson maybe can be learned about the schools and they're closing down schools and the sense of stability and continuity that is lost
sometimes I wonder if we romanticize rootedness to some extent. I mean, one of the things, in urban studies, we're
Poor laws kept people very rooted.
In urban studies, we're talking about displacement and gentrification all the time. And we actually, I've been looking at residential stability among low-income African-American homeowners in Philadelphia. And in some ways, it's sort of remarkable. There are whole neighborhoods in Philadelphia where like a huge proportion of the population has lived there since 1980. Now, is that just because they're rooted and they love those communities? Well, maybe, or maybe it's because there was no market for that real estate for decades. So we're actually at this tipping point now in Philadelphia where suddenly a whole set of neighborhoods where you literally couldn't give away houses for 20 years. Like suddenly developers are showing up cash for houses, signs all over the place. So, it raises a bunch of complex issues. We're looking at a couple of neighborhoods very close to here that are going through this. But it made me realize that sometimes we interpret rootedness as like inevitably a good thing, but if you're stuck because you can't get rid of your house, it may not be like the most positive kind of rootedness.
Well, it shouldn't be rootedness at the expense of good housing.
So,
We should talk about it.
So from the twinkle in Danya's eyes, I can see that she has a pre-post design in mind. So I wanted to return to this point, sort of the distinction that Timness makes between residual rights and like actual real social rights. And it seems to me that social rights do imply more than a roof over your head. And in the Marshallian framework, social rights actually, I think, imply, maybe this is pushing it too far, but let's just play with this idea for a minute. Do they imply actually a right to civic participation? So you mentioned the sort of constant duality of housing policy. As you said in your comments, declaring the right to housing in the same breath as destroying neighborhoods. And you talk about this in the paper too, how this is sort of an ongoing fact of housing policy in the US. And I wonder if we look at these episodes of sort of the declaration of the right to housing and then the simultaneous disruption of existing communities. If we do this sequentially, I wonder if this can tell us something about the desired forms of civic participation and citizenship that are being sort of promulgated by housing policymakers that look sort of different over time. So when you look at this sort of structured mobilization that's embodied in these mandated tenant councils in public housing projects, right? This implies a very different view of what the full right to housing looks like and sort of the associated social rights that go along with housing. That applies a very different view from demolishing public housing and shifting people out into the private market with no sort of schemes for structured mobilization. So I wonder if taking a more sort of diachronic view might help us to better integrate the right to housing and the idea of a social right. Yeah.
Which she said.
I think that's a whole, it is, the tenants houses are mandated, so there was a particular vision for civic participation that was like embedded in the policy, that clearly isn't, today's law.
Right. I mean, in the same way that like federally qualified community health centers had participatory patient boards, and a lot of the sort of Great Society programs did have that vision of civic participation.
Just across policy domains, like across, not just housing, but think about, how broad range of social policy stuff is to be, it has some sort of mandate for mechanism or what you will for the other things.
Structured mobilization.
Structured mobilization.
And really now, the substitution of kind of a consumerism notion and
Right.
like customer satisfaction is what we get instead.
Right, and that's what civic participation, like, it's not just that that's what we do, like, I think that's actually the goal, right? The goal is to champion channel civic participation into consumer behavior.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a too cynical view, but I mean, I think that we should look not only at the instances where things that we recognize as civic participation are built into the programming, but also at the instances where it's not, and to say, well, what is the underlying view of citizens participation that this really implies for us?
No, I think it's very upfront and conscious. I mean, I hang out with like some nonprofit housing developers, and like the customer's always right. You know, it's like that's the ethos.
Yeah.
I guess I had a question whether or not you've interviewed any of the longer term residents in these private developments that these people are going to, because it seems like that might be a way that you can get at the question of whether or not it's rootedness or stability, or whether it's fundamental between private and public. Because you seem to suggest in your paper that it's not that these are newcomers to these buildings, but these buildings don't have the sorts of institutional means to even have these sorts of communities in the first place. So I'm just wondering if you find that the people that have been there for longer, if you have those interviews, if they've been there for longer, they're expressing the same type of like lack of neighborliness or that same type of lack of opportunity as for the newer residents who are moving into the private.
I don't have those interviews, but I think those interviews exist because I know that the folks at Georgia State are doing interviews in the neighborhoods where public housing, and one of the things they're interested in is issue of stigma, but they have, so they haven't gone and asking about civic participation but those data might be there to look at that interview. That'd be really interesting. I mean, there are homeowners organizations, neighborhood organizations that I don't know enough about how they operate that maybe might function the way that tenants councils did, but although I kind of doubt that they have the same, that they're structured and
I just thought that might be interesting. It might suggest that there's something about public education, the fact that it was more of a right that you have public education, or public housing that you don't even have in the private marketplace. So it's not just about low income, it's public versus private.
No, I think that's a really good point. And it would be, and I think those interviews exist, so it might be worth going and looking at that.
And like a historic example of that is with MTO, when they folks who were being moved out of concentrated poverty neighborhoods in Baltimore were being moved to Baltimore County places, and there was a lot of civic engagement in those target neighborhoods because they were working to keep their so a little complicated.
But I think you bring up another point, that there is this sort of, in Chicago, like the public housing owners have their own journal, they have their own, and they really protested against, against the demolition of these projects. Like we have a right to these places that are public, that are publicly, So I think it's interesting that people aren't expressing the same. You don't see the same protests when people get evicted every day from low-income private housing eviction. So I don't know.
One of the major problems that I see with the voucher program is that there's no government oversight at all. Let me give you an example. I know of a nonprofit organization in Philadelphia. They recruit people from drug and alcohol programs and people with mental illness, and they put them in their building. But for years they've had drug dealing, major crime in the building. So they've been totally irresponsible. But there's no way legally that the residents can get a redress for the mismanagement of the voucher program. So there needs to be some legislation. In other words, if you mismanage a voucher program, you're more interested in collecting a buck than you are providing quality housing for everyone in that building. You should be able to be stripped of that vouchers. If you have a history of abuse and allowing drug dealers and other criminals to run the building, then you should be allowed to have a voucher system. Right now, there is the city of Philadelphia has no jurisdiction. The state of Pennsylvania or the federal government, they can't do anything about the mismanagement of the voucher programs the way they're set up today.
This suggests that there's an accountability, part of the civic participation is because there has to be someone accountable.
Yes, someone accountable.
If there's no one accountable in these market structures, then it's very hard to know how to target your civic participation. More questions? Yes. 1, 2, and 3.
Yes,
Go ahead.
adding upon some point that was raised just now about the changing nature of civic participation and what is expected to be like neighborhood. You did mention that there were some differences between like the younger folks and the ones who were there for a long time. But could you also talk like whether there were any generational differences in like what is expected to be a community and like the changing perspective of like what is it to be engaged in community, especially in the context of the younger folks who have different forms of socialization that are not available to the previous generation. So can you speak to that?
I'm going to collect a couple.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You're next.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I don't know.
I guess, I think it was a question whether the word right goes with a collective. I'm wondering if it's sort of like the public-private thing you were getting at, but if my background is just to throw in another discipline with city planning, and one of the things that came out, I think, in the article was just spaces and opportunities for communal life, which then lead, besides the council, besides the organizational structure, just spaces or places like I think the seniors who moved into some other housing authorities had spaces that were conducive to starting up new kinds of organizations that the people in the private market didn't have, unless you're in a condo. Like condos now have, public spaces and all, but or pools or gyms or something. But like as a planner, we have, the library, the rec center, you have guidelines around good neighborhoods, and then like your neighborhood amenities. How far should someone be from a grocery store or basic services, or how far should you be from community facilities and services? And we never use the word right for that. It was more like, I don't know what the word is, but it's a comment, it's a set of, it's a public domain framing.
I mean, if it's
And
involved,
if it's a right, then every individual gets a lawyer. It's different. You know what I mean? It changes the entire mode of advocacy or whatever. And I'm not sure if what you're looking for fits the right language.
I was also curious in interviews if the concept of neighborhood amenities came up. Just this idea of like part of deconcentrating poverty in public housing, the idea being that you're giving people access to neighborhoods where there's greater amenities, private market amenities available. So I wonder if do people sort of articulate that?
let's take one more in this batch, if there is one more. Yeah.
So I was interested in thinking about the efficacy, the political efficacy of this idea of social right. And it reminded me of the work of the anthropologist Danya Keene. So he's looking at the tracking the change in discourse in France for asylum seekers. And he, the basic argument, I guess, is how people who had previously sought asylum based on the language of human rights were rejected. But those same people who appealed on humanitarian reasons, kind of more affective language, were then given asylum. And so I guess I'm just interested in kind of the efficacy of even the language of social right.
I love this question about the generational differences and what it means to different generations' language. I think I would like to go back to the data and look at that. I think there's two things happening. I think these developments were different places in the time of the older generation, when the older generations were younger. I think there's the crime that we hear a lot about, there's a sort of stigma about, it also is a reality, and it's a reality of more recent years, and I think that sort of changed how younger generations interact with their community. But I was surprised by the number of young folks who, or at least not the number, because I don't know a lot of them, but that there were examples of these younger folks saying that and this one kid, he took the brick from his, when he moved, he took a brick with him, and he goes back to the spot of the former development, and he's sad, and so even the young folks had these like attachments to place, which sort of surprised me. But yeah, I think there's definitely generational differences that are sort of like what period, age and period affects differences, and I have to go back and look at that, and I think, yeah, so that's important. I just haven't thought about it enough to say anything about it. So the spaces for communal life. I think space is really, I guess there's two questions. One is like how much does space play a role here? Like how much does sort of the planning of the communities play a role in these? And then the second question is are these even rights issues? And so I think, people did talk about how space was managed in their new private complexes. But one thing that came up a couple times was, there's all these rules in these new places that you're not allowed to barbecue on your front step. So I think there's also sort of class differences and also who gets to decide how space is used. And I think it's really important. Mary Patillo actually has a great ethnography of this mixed income African American neighborhood in Chicago, where she talks about sort of this middle class policing of space that lower income residents feel that they don't have access to the public spaces, even though they're everybody's public spaces. So they're supposed to be used in a certain way, and you're supposed to barbecue in your backyard. You're not supposed to hang out in your front stoop, and so I think those issues are really important. And there's definitely a different sort of ethos about how space should be used in a lot of these private developments. So whether that's a right, I don't know how to answer that. I don't know if
Well, I think that for me, it's, to go back to your comment too, there's a way in which the discussion of housing doesn't really fit very comfortably into this talking about social rights. In a certain way, we're sort of trying to shoehorn it in. But on the one hand, you've got this like residual right to like not be totally neglected. On the other hand, we've got property rights, which aren't so, which are some other kind of right. So in a certain way, it's just not a very well-developed.
But also, for those of you following along at home, this is not the first time this year that we've had this sort of growing discontent with the language of rights around these social issues. We saw it in the opening panel, we saw it in Sam Baggin's talk. This is not the first time this issue has come up, so I think being attentive to the discomfort that our audience is expressing with the use of this language of rights is really important.
And I'd add that the framing of the theme in terms of social rights was not meant to say you had to presume this is the right way to do it. It was rather to invite the discussion of whether this is a good way of thinking about them. At the same time, I've just come for a class where we were discussing how in the South African Constitution, and in some other constitutions around the world, we are declaring housing and other matters to be matters of rights. Whether this is a good development or not, it is a real development in the world. It's not simply an academic imposition.
One thing I meant was, I realized that I actually love the word social rights, and that's why I've come to the series. I just wonder if something about the language doesn't suit these collective, I feel like right invites individual entitlement versus collective entitlement. That's what I meant by that. It's not that I actually, love to have a set of social rights, but so it's mostly we all. I guess what I meant was, does it even work in the U.S. or something? That's all I meant. Which is.
Thanks for raising. Do you want to respond?
Oh, yeah. So the political efficacy. So was your question? So about the political efficacy of the public housing residents in their, or in
just getting. So I guess my question is whether you've observed some shift in discourse from, because I don't know, my sense of it is that social rights was had a lot of traction during the 50s, 60s, or using that term, right? And now it seems like, at least in France, this particular anthropologist I'm talking about, he was saying how rights, the use of language of rights hasn't really been as effective for refugees, right? But appealing, for them, appealing based more on affective language of, it's compassionate, it's humanitarian, and has been kind of more effective. And so I guess I just kind of wonder if there has been similar shifts.
That's really interesting. I guess, in the whole discourse around housing assistance, I feel like there's been a shift in a discourse about rights to a discourse about choice. That the problem with these projects is that people were confined to these places. They should have the opportunity to choose. They should have the opportunity to move around. And so, I think that's definitely a shift in the discourse that's happened around housing policy. That may not be answering your question, but I think that's as close as I'm going to get. Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry to point, but I don't know everybody's names in these big interdisciplinary settings. Mary, take us off.
So just this is a sort of follow-up on two issues that were raised. One is on the generational one. The other issue I'd be interested in is whether younger people remembered the political engagement in this, or the whatever we're calling that. I have an image of tenant housing councils, at least some, as sort of dominated by the old people who set the standards and don't let the young people be engaged, and whether it's that's kind of their club, and whether that that there's very little turnover, there's very little elections, so that would be one question. The other question that's related to this, to whether we're calling this a right and whether we're calling this a right to rootedness, is to sort of think about, so how does that work? It seems to me, so I'd like to know a couple of things, like what's the comparative data for middle and upper class people? It seems to me that part of this trend has been, they don't need rootedness, they need choice, so we want to give poor people that same opportunity for choice. And I feel like your work is a very important, hey, wait a minute, when choices are imposed on you and they're not very good choices, that's very different from somebody getting to move because they got a great job. There's a fair amount of lamenting about moving when kids always hate to move, but our society presumes a lot of moving. And so I guess I'm kind of nervous about, poor people really need one set of rights, but middle class people need another, sort of, I guess, so those are my two.
Yeah, those are both really, really important points.
I think she has other people that wrote that.
Those are two. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So the generational. So now that I actually don't think, and I really have to think more about the generational. I think young people, they're talking about they miss, like you said, young people don't like to move. They're talking about they miss their friends, they miss their home, but they're not talking about the loss of political engagement that the older folks are talking about, which I have to think about a little bit. And also, that which makes me think about your comment about, it's just the old folks, and how paternalistic were these tenant organizations. Like this one woman, Jocelyn, who's like, I can't help them now, they're on their own, they're getting themselves into trouble, and they don't have me to look out for them. And that a couple people said that. And so I wonder what, in another paper I wrote about how for the health of these old folks, how that was so good for them to have these roles. That's looking out for the community, that was really important for their well-being. And so I think it may be important to think about, a little bit more about these generational issues and, who is the survey? Was it really, I mean, getting the bus was good for everybody, I don't think, but yeah, that's important. And okay, so I struggle with this too. Are we saying that, I just moved, I'm excited that I just moved, are we saying that, poor people should stay in one place? And I think it's about, I think that, I think people should, I'm not opposed to this voucher model where people have the people can have the opportunity to live where they want to live, and for some people it's worked out really well, but if it's the right to choose, not being able to afford your house, being evicted because you can't pay your utility bills, we didn't answer the amenities question, which I think plays into like moving, living farther away from, you used to live like right downtown, and now you live far away from, and also not really having a choice because, like the people I interviewed from Chicago, like one woman, she talked about how she looked at 19, she looked at 19 apartments and didn't get any of them. So I think it's about, do you really have a choice? And making sure there are real viable options on the table. And if one of those, the best one is going to be, in a project where you have some stability, hopefully that's in better condition because they should be better funded and better maintained and not in bad neighborhoods. So I think it's about having a good set of choices. So, yeah. But the amenities, can I say the amenities? Because I forgot. So in Atlanta, in Atlanta actually, for many people, it's the case that the amenities are much worse in the private market housing. And they were right next to Grady Hospital where everybody gets their care. They were right downtown. They were on the bus route. And some really cynical folks would say that the demolition of these places was these places were like prime real estate often. So a lot of that's one of the challenges that people talk about after. It's like, how do I get to my doctor? It's like 3 buses. And it takes me an hour. So I think that's almost universal. Well, there were a couple who moved right downtown and had good amenities, but almost universally the amenities are worse.
I guess just on the mobility question, it's just, low-income populations are much more dependent on personal and social networks for providing resources that other people can just buy. So, I don't know if it's so much the rootedness of the fact that this disruption of networks, can have a profound negative effect. And I think that's why the MTO stuff found all these people being irrational by moving them into crummy neighborhoods because they were close to their social networks.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that, that if you can't buy those resources, you're going to have to rely on your other family, and so your family becomes even more important.
Well, the discussion of private amenities is almost the ideal segue to my question was about public goods, provision of public goods. So both if we're thinking about housing as a right or as a commitment that society makes to every individual, or if we're thinking about the quality of the neighborhood, if you're stuck somewhere or you're rooted somewhere, however you think of it, it doesn't just matter what your house looks like, but what, say the police force is doing for the security of your home and your neighborhood, or what school your children are going to. I was just wondering how you saw public goods and the provision of them mapping onto the housing right issue, where it's also kind of a provision of a public good, you might think of it that way.
Let's take one more right here.
Well, my question is a lot. I studied education and parallels in privatization and oppressing, but this idea of the discourse of rights, the discourse of choice, I think is really interesting. And I guess what this is all making me think about is that the people who are arguing that choice is the way to go are, in a sense, arguing the rights, or making the rights argument too, because they keep saying, this is the civil rights issue of the current era. So their point is, and I think several of what Mary was saying, that poor people should have a right to choose the school they go to, just as much as middle class people have a right to move or buy private school. And it comes back to this question of civic engagement, I think, because when you have the right to move, when moving choice and moving instability has been the preferred strategy, then there isn't really as much of a need for civic engagement. Because civic engagement is kind of around, a lot of it is around place, and it's around looking beyond beyond yourself as an individual. It's about thinking about who else in my situation can I work, on behalf of. So anyway, I guess this discourse issue is kind of something that I'm trying to figure out how to sort of demonstrate, I guess, that it's all relative in a way, but that there are gains and losses, depending on, how you define the right words.
One more, and then I think we're going to be out of time for questions. So I just wanted to push a little bit on this whole talking about housing as a right issue. And I wonder if it's not useful to use Carol Gilligan's language of ethics of care, and so ethics of rights versus ethics of care. And if it's not useful to sort of re-envision or reframe the way that we talk about housing as sort of as a commitment or as something that other people have raised. And so this right of rootedness versus this care or commitment to the government in certain areas, does that sort of change the way that we understand what housing is about, and then what these discussions that are coming out in your interviews might be about?
It's your turn. It's my turn. Or Mark. Who's first? You were first. And it was about
public goods.
Public goods. So the question was about how public goods are provided along with housing.
Yeah, and also how you can think of housing itself as a public good.
Yeah.
It changes it's sort of going along with Danielle's question about how you talk about these commitments. It's the provision of a public good. You necessarily have to couch it in language about social rights.
Yeah.
You can pass if you want to.
I'm thinking about it.
Really good point.
I think it's a really good point. I'm going to think on it.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But could I just make a comment? I think part of the reason that there's an urge to pass it in terms of social rights is that lawyers have always been really good advocates for people. And so if you can make a rights question out of it, then you can go to court with it and you can win something. And I think it's much harder to do that through like other political channels. So I think that's part of why we've got that.
See, and I think the benefit the Marxists have is that, they think all that law stuff is bull, and that it's the extent of the proletariat to demand stuff from the bourgeoisie. So it clarifies the right stuff, to like get into all that stuff about courts. Go out and grab, and that's it, right.
But what happens if you shift, instead of thinking about the provision of affordable housing as an issue of rights, of the individuals who need housing, what if you think of it as an obligation of the government to provide a public good, and then public goods, come with a whole other set of baggage, providing public goods sometimes has negative externalities, but it's a different way of thinking about what the problem is, and I think it might be useful to just think about what were these public housing developments as public goods, and what are voucher programs as public goods. They look really different as public goods, and that has, I think so. I'm not sure what shifting that perspective tells us, but I'm quite certain that it tells us something interesting.
And it's a really good point.
Yes. And it's a really good point, and you'll have to think more about it.
Yes. Exactly.
I will.
And it forces us to think about the relationship as opposed to just thinking about the good itself, so public housing. It forces us to think about the relationship between the individual receiving the good and the organization sort of giving out that good, right? And that seems to be, in some sense, what you're getting at as well, especially when you're asking questions about civic engagement, right? And that seems to be where civic engagement might come in.
Right, because that's a relationship between the housing recipient as citizen and the provider government as the governed, and this gets these questions about accountability that we were raising before. Yeah, that's nice.
Nice question.
This might be like a reframing.
But it's important that different discourses work differently at different times in different settings. There are times when rights talk can be a basis for big social movement mobilization. Sometimes it's just talk that can get to important. And similarly, public goods, it's not true that sort of conceptual structuring of the language necessarily determines the political role that it will play. So I think there's a lot to be said for being opportunistic about whatever language is going to work now and mobilize people.
But neither rights nor public goods seem to have much traction. Yeah, I mean, maybe we go back to Didier Fassan's stuff and we make this all about, humanitarianism, and survey research that I've done shows that that's much more bipartisan. Sort of humanitarian ethic is much more bipartisan than any of the sort of rights-based stuff, but it's also lame and it doesn't do anything. So we should probably wrap things up. Thank you all for coming.